Burned to the ground, the Tulsa Massacre remembered. Chapter 1: A Prosperous Beginning. In the early 1900s, nestled in the northern part of Tulsa, Oklahoma, there thrived a community unlike any other in the United States. Known as Greenwood, it was a beacon of Black excellence, success, and resilience. With its own schools, hospitals, banks, libraries, restaurants, and newspapers, Greenwood stood as a shining example of what was possible despite the overwhelming racial segregation of the time. Referred to by many as the Black Wall Street, Greenwood was the product of tireless effort by Black families who had traveled far from southern plantations, carrying with them nothing but hope, skill, and a fierce determination to claim their share of the American dream. They built their homes from scratch, opened businesses with small savings, and created a self-sustaining community that quickly became one of the most affluent Black neighborhoods in the country. Men wore suits and polished shoes, women walked the streets in elegant dresses, and children attended well-maintained schools where they were taught to aim high. Jazz music floated from open windows, and the air buzzed with ambition. Barber shops, tailor shops, pharmacies, theaters, and cafes lined the streets. Every brick laid a testament to dignity and independence. The wealth in Greenwood was not measured solely by money, but by the richness of culture, the unity of its people, and the pride they took in each other's success. Doctors, lawyers, teachers, and entrepreneurs all lived within blocks of one another, creating an economic and social ecosystem that supported everyone. But just beneath this bright surface, the weight of racial inequality pressed in. White Tulsa, located just across the railroad tracks, watched Greenwood's success with growing resentment. In a deeply segregated America, Black prosperity was often met not with applause, but with suspicion and jealousy. Still, the people of Greenwood pressed forward. They had no reason to believe the dream they had so carefully built could crumble overnight. But it would, and the world would never be the same again. Chapter 2: The Greenwood Legacy. The story of Greenwood was not born overnight. Its roots stretched deep into the soil of struggle, survival, and vision. In the decades following the end of slavery, formerly enslaved African Americans and their descendants sought freedom not just in body, but in opportunity. Some migrated west, hoping to escape the suffocating racism of the post-Reconstruction South. Oklahoma, once designated as Indian Territory, became a land of possibility. Among those who settled in Tulsa were skilled laborers, business owners, ministers, and educators. They came with ambition, and they found a shared purpose in building something of their own, free from interference. What began as a small Black settlement on the outskirts of Tulsa grew steadily into a thriving neighborhood known as Greenwood, named for a street in Mississippi where many of its residents had once lived. Central to Greenwood's growth was the determination to uplift one another. Land was bought, homes were built, and businesses were born. Churches became the beating heart of the community, places not just of worship, but of planning, education, and resilience. Schools, funded and staffed by Black residents, provided children with more than reading and arithmetic. They instilled pride in Black history, culture, and identity. Perhaps no figure better symbolizes this spirit than O.W. Gurley, a wealthy Black landowner who purchased 40 acres of land and sold it exclusively to other Black settlers. His investment became the foundation of Greenwood's commercial district, encouraging others to start businesses. J.B. Stratford, a lawyer and entrepreneur, built the luxurious Stratford Hotel, one of the largest black-owned hotels in the United States at the time. Through mutual support, residents of Greenwood created a model of black economic independence. Black doctors treated black patients, black lawyers defended black clients, and money stayed within the community, circulating dozens of times before ever leaving. It was not only a neighborhood but a statement that black Americans could thrive despite the laws and hatred stacked against them. The legacy of Greenwood was one of unity, vision, and self-sufficiency. It inspired pride, both within Tulsa and beyond. It was a symbol of what Black America could be, a legacy that would become both its strength and, tragically, the reason for its targeting. Chapter 3. Rising Walls, Rising Hope. As Greenwood's footprint expanded, so did its ambitions. With each new house built, each storefront opened, and each diploma earned, the people of Greenwood were not just building a neighborhood, they were building a future. From the red clay earth, they raised walls that symbolized progress, strength, and resistance. Brick by brick, the once modest cluster of homes had become a city within a city. By the 1910s, Greenwood boasted over 600 black-owned businesses, including 2 movie theaters, 21 churches, 30 restaurants, a library, and even a private airline. This rapid development wasn't just economic, it was spiritual and cultural. Greenwood pulsed with a sense of collective pride that was rarely seen in black communities during an era steeped in racism. At the heart of this growth were the schools. Parents and educators believed deeply in the power of education to break generational cycles. Children were encouraged to dream, to study, to rise. Community fundraisers and church drives ensured classrooms stayed open and supplied. Many of Greenwood's youth went on to pursue higher education, some returning home to become the next generation of teachers and leaders. Home ownership was another pillar of Greenwood's stability. Families took immense pride in their homes, small, neat houses with tended gardens and porches lined with rocking chairs. These homes were sanctuaries, places where dreams were nurtured and futures imagined. The businesses that formed the commercial spine of Greenwood were more than financial ventures. They were lifelines. Barber shops where politics were debated, pharmacies that doubled as informal health clinics, and cafes where neighbors gathered to celebrate or grieve. Every establishment had a story, a family behind it, a legacy it aimed to build. And all of this, every wall, every school book, every church pew, stood as defiance against the belief that Black Americans could not thrive independently. Greenwood was not just surviving, it was flourishing. Its people believed they had carved out a space that could weather any storm. But outside those rising walls, storm clouds were already gathering, and their hope would soon be tested beyond anything they could imagine. Chapter 4. The Spark in the Elevator. On the morning of May 30, 1921, a single encounter in a downtown Tulsa office building would set into motion a tragedy that would devastate Greenwood. That morning, a 19-year-old black shoe shiner named Dick Rowland entered the Drexel building, one of the few places where black Tulsans were allowed to use a restroom while working in the segregated downtown district. He took the elevator to the upper floor, operated by 17-year-old Sarah Page, a white girl employed as the building's elevator operator. What happened next remains unclear. Some say the elevator jolted, causing Rowland to stumble into Page. Others believe their interaction may have been more familiar than society at the time could accept. But what is certain is that Sarah Page screamed and Dick Rowland fled. By the afternoon, rumors had begun to spread throughout Tulsa. The local white-owned newspaper, the Tulsa Tribune, printed a now-lost editorial under the headline, "Nab Negro for Attacking Girl in Elevator." Though Page did not press charges and later refused to testify against Rowland, the accusation had already set the city ablaze with anger and fear. That evening, Dick Rowland was arrested and held at the courthouse. Though there was no evidence of wrongdoing, the racial dynamics of the Jim Crow South had little need for truth. The mere implication that a black man had assaulted a white girl was enough to inflame deep-rooted hatred and mobilize the worst instincts of white Tulsa's citizens. As night fell, a crowd began to gather outside the courthouse, white Tulsans demanding Rowland be lynched. The spark had been lit, the fuse was burning, and Greenwood was about to burn with it. Chapter 5. A City on Edge. By the morning of May 31, 1921, Tulsa was no longer a city holding its breath. It was a city bracing for violence. News of the alleged incident between Dick Rowland and Sarah Page had spread like wildfire, fanned by inflammatory headlines and whisper campaigns. The tension between black and white Tulsans, always present, now crackled in the air like a coming storm. Word spread quickly in Greenwood. Fear took root. Men gathered in small groups, discussing what was to come. Many were veterans of World War I, men who had fought bravely for their country, only to return home to second-class citizenship. They would not stand by while a young black man was taken and murdered by a mob. Rumors of a lynching reached the black community that afternoon. Knowing the horrific history of such mob violence, several dozen black men, some armed, marched to the courthouse with a single purpose: to protect Dick Rowland. They were met with hostility by the growing white crowd, now numbering in the hundreds, many of them also armed. The sheriff attempted to calm the situation, insisting that Rowland would not be lynched, but trust was fragile, and words held little weight against the rising tide of racial hatred. Greenwood residents returned home, but remained on alert. More men gathered as the sun set, waiting for word, waiting for a signal. That evening, a second group of black men, this time about 75 strong, returned to the courthouse to stand guard. They were once again confronted by the white crowd, now swelled to the thousands. Insults turned to shouts, shouts turned to threats. And then a shot rang out. No one knows who fired first, but in that single moment, all hope of peaceful resolution vanished. The shot became a spark, and the spark became an explosion. Tulsa would never be the same again. Chapter 6. The Mob Gathers. As the shot echoed through the night, the thin veil separating tension from chaos was ripped apart. The crowd outside the courthouse erupted, some scattering in panic, others diving into action. Within minutes, the streets around downtown Tulsa became a chaotic frenzy of yelling, running, and gunfire. The night had turned, and there would be no turning back. White Tulsans, already inflamed by rumors and hatred, quickly began to organize. Some were ordinary citizens, businessmen, shopkeepers, clerks, swept up in the hysteria. Others were members of law enforcement who either turned a blind eye or actively joined the violence. Armed with rifles, pistols, and even shotguns, they poured into the streets, determined to push back against what they now saw as a black uprising. The idea that black residents would dare to protect one of their own was, to many, an unforgivable act of defiance. It became the justification for retaliation. The mob grew rapidly, fed by fear and fueled by a poisonous sense of entitlement. Across town, word reached Greenwood that the situation had escalated. Black families began preparing for the worst. Fathers barricaded doors, mothers gathered their children, churches opened their doors as makeshift shelters. Community leaders met in urgent huddles, trying to make sense of the unraveling horror. As the clock ticked past midnight, the mob began to move north. Hundreds, then thousands of white men marched toward Greenwood, many shouting, some laughing, others deadly silent. Some carried torches, others carried gasoline. They weren't just coming to settle a score. They were coming to erase a community. And behind every step they took was the full weight of a system that had always looked away. The flames of hatred had been lit, and Greenwood stood directly in their path. Chapter 7. Smoke over Greenwood. As dawn broke on June 1, 1921, Greenwood woke not to birdsong or the clatter of early street vendors, but to the sound of gunfire, breaking glass, and the rising hiss of flames. The mob had arrived. The armed white rioters poured into the district from every direction, guns raised, torches in hand. They met little organized resistance, just terrified families, exhausted community members, and young men with whatever weapons they had managed to gather overnight. But the mob had numbers, firepower, and the devastating advantage of coordination. Some wore badges, some carried official weapons, others were deputized on the spot. Smoke began to rise from the southern edge of Greenwood, curling upward like a signal to the rest of the city. Black-owned businesses were smashed, looted, then torched. Homes were set ablaze. The two-story buildings that had once symbolized Greenwood's prosperity crumbled in minutes under the weight of fire and bullets. Witnesses reported white men with oil cans pouring gasoline on porches. Others hurled Molotov cocktails through windows. Gunshots echoed in every direction. Those who ran were shot. Those who stayed were dragged into the streets. Women screamed. Children hid under floorboards. Elders clutched Bibles, praying that the storm would pass. It did not. The air turned thick with smoke and ash. The once proud heart of Greenwood, with its busy shops and music-filled homes, became a battlefield. Flames licked at the sky as if trying to swallow it, and through the smoke, a terrible truth took shape. This was not a riot. This was an invasion. A purge. Planes, likely operated by white pilots from nearby airfields, appeared above the neighborhood. Survivors would later describe seeing incendiary devices dropped from the skies, homemade bombs falling on buildings already burning. The smoke cloud could be seen for miles. Greenwood, the pride of Black America, was burning, and no one was coming to help. Chapter 8. The sky rains fire. As morning brightened, so too did the horror. Greenwood, already engulfed in smoke, now faced an assault from above. The sound of low-flying planes pierced the air. People ran into the streets, shielding their eyes to make sense of what was coming. What they saw defied belief. Airplanes, small biplanes from Tulsa's private airfields, flew low over the neighborhood, circling deliberately. Then came the flashes. Bursts of flame and smoke, Witnesses watched in stunned disbelief as incendiary devices were dropped from the sky. Homemade bombs rained down on homes, churches, schools, and shops. Some pilots even fired rifles at fleeing families. The attack from the air added a new, terrifying layer to the destruction. It transformed the massacre into something closer to a military operation. Greenwood, once a sanctuary, now looked like a war zone. The planes didn't just destroy buildings, they destroyed hope. People screamed and scattered in every direction. Families ran for cover, some diving into basements, others sprinting toward open fields. Parents clutched their children, trying to shield them from the raining fire. Debris and glass exploded into the streets. Smoke choked the air so thickly that some collapsed simply from inhaling. One by one, landmarks of Greenwood disappeared in flame. The Stratford Hotel, once a symbol of black prosperity, was burned to its foundation. Churches that had served as places of refuge became rubble. Schools were obliterated, and the very ground seemed to groan under the weight of so much loss. Even those trying to escape found themselves hunted. White mobs with rifles waited at the city's edges, firing at those who tried to flee. Some black families hid in the woods for days. Others were captured and marched at gunpoint to detention centers set up across Tulsa. Parks, fairgrounds, even the convention hall. Greenwood was no longer a neighborhood. It was a memory being erased in real time. And the sky above, the one that had once watched over dreams and jazz and morning sun, now rained down only fire and hate. Chapter 9. Running for their lives. The streets of Greenwood had become a maze of fire, gunfire, and falling ash. Every corner turned brought either a blockade of rioters or a building collapsing in flame. Entire families fled their homes with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Mothers clutched infants. Children cried out for parents who had vanished in the smoke. Elders struggled to keep up, their hands trembling not just from age, but from the terror that swept through the air like poison. Survival depended on instinct. Some ran toward the railroad tracks, hoping the divide that once separated Greenwood from White Tulsa might now offer an escape. Others scattered toward the woods, diving into creeks and ducking beneath bridges. Gunshots followed them. Stories would later surface of entire families hunted as they ran, fired upon by men who stood atop trucks and porches, laughing as they took aim. The Red Cross would later record the testimonies of those who had hidden in outhouses, ditches, and chicken coops to escape detection. A teenage girl recalled lying still beneath a neighbor's porch for over 14 hours, hearing her home burn behind her. A mother described using her own body to shield her son from falling embers as they lay in a muddy creek bed. Others were captured and marched at gunpoint to holding centers. For some, running ended not in safety, but in detainment. The city's white leadership, rather than intervene to stop the violence, helped organize the imprisonment of thousands of black residents under the guise of public safety. Detention centers were hastily set up at the fairgrounds, the convention hall, and baseball fields. There, black men, women, and children were registered like criminals, held behind barbed wire, and denied the freedom to return to the ruins of their homes. By the end of June 1, more than 10,000 black Tulsans had been displaced. Some ran, some hid, some never made it out at all. And all of it happened in a city that refused to see the people of Greenwood as its own. For the residents of Greenwood, survival was not victory. It was exile. Chapter 10. Ashes and Silence. When the fires finally died down, what remained of Greenwood was a graveyard of dreams. Where once there had been busy streets lined with businesses, now there was only rubble. Where music once floated from parlor windows, there was only the sound of creaking beams and the hiss of smoldering wood. Ash blanketed everything. The air still carried the acrid sting of smoke. Families walked through the ruins of their homes, unable to speak, too stunned to cry. Some sifted through the charred remains of their belongings, finding a twisted fork, a scorched family photo, the iron skeleton of a piano. The silence was deafening. Nearly 40 square blocks had been reduced to ash. Over 1,200 homes were destroyed. Dozens of businesses had been obliterated, and though official records claimed around 3 dozen deaths, survivors would tell of bodies dumped into mass graves, rivers, and incinerators. The true toll, many believe, was in the hundreds. Greenwood's churches had been destroyed, its schools and hospitals gone. Thousands were left without shelter. And yet, amid the devastation, city officials and white newspapers spun the tragedy as the result of a black rebellion. No one from the mob was arrested. Insurance companies refused to pay out claims for acts of riot. The city turned its back on Greenwood, but the people did not. Even in silence, even in ash, Greenwood's spirit endured. Women set up outdoor kitchens to feed their neighbors. Men cleared debris with bare hands. Makeshift homes of scrap wood and tin sprang up, and amid the devastation, families still gathered to pray on blackened church steps, in burnt-out living rooms, wherever they could. From the ashes, they began to rise, not because they were unafraid, but because they refused to be forgotten. Chapter 11. A City Erased. In the days following the massacre, Greenwood stood not as a community, but as a skeleton of its former self. The once vibrant district was unrecognizable, its streets reduced to ash, its skyline now smoldering ruins. What was once called the Black Wall Street had been reduced to memory, swallowed by fire and hatred. Yet what hurt even more than the physical destruction was the silence that followed. Tulsa's white newspapers shifted their focus. Headlines no longer mentioned the massacre, and stories about rebuilding offered little more than empty sympathy. The very city that had allowed its citizens to destroy Greenwood began to act as though it had never existed at all. Survivors who dared to return to the ruins of their homes found the city uninterested in their plight. Aid was withheld. Promises of support went unfulfilled. Instead, the city placed the burden of rebuilding squarely on the shoulders of those who had lost everything. Many were told they could only rebuild using fireproof materials they couldn't afford. Some residents camped on the ashes of their old homes. Others moved into tents set up by the Red Cross. Still others left Tulsa entirely, unable to bear the weight of what had been taken from them. To the outside world, the massacre quickly faded from view. No state investigation was launched, no one was prosecuted, and within Tulsa, the schools never taught the truth. It was as if the city had chosen to erase Greenwood not once, but twice. First by fire, then by silence. Photographs of the devastation were hidden, documents disappeared, survivors were told to forget. But they didn't. They carried Greenwood in their memories, in whispered stories passed down to children, in the yellowed photographs hidden in family Bibles, in the unmarked graves where so many were buried. They held on to the names of neighbors, the rhythms of jazz still echoing in their hearts, the pride that no flame could erase. A city had been erased, but the soul of Greenwood still burned quietly in those who remembered. Chapter 12. Surviving the Aftermath. The smoke had lifted, but the weight of devastation hung thick in the air. Greenwood, stripped to its bones, was a landscape of sorrow, but within that sorrow, survival pulsed quietly. The residents, left with nothing, began the impossible task of rebuilding their lives from ash and memory. For weeks, thousands of survivors lived in tents provided by the Red Cross, forming makeshift neighborhoods out of canvas and scraps. These temporary camps became places of mourning, but also of resolve. Men who had once run shops now hammered together shelters with salvaged wood. Women organized kitchens to feed entire blocks. Children played in the dust, unaware that their innocence was now rooted in one of the worst acts of racial violence in American history. There was no government aid, no insurance payouts. The city passed ordinances restricting rebuilding unless fireproof materials, expensive and hard to find, were used. These laws, masked as safety regulations, were designed to prevent Greenwood's revival. Yet, the people resisted. Churches became centers of coordination. Ministers preached messages, not of hate, but of hope. Business owners gathered in basements and backyards, exchanging tools, offering labor, and imagining what could be built again. The community that had been burned to the ground refused to vanish quietly. The emotional toll, however, was immense. Families grieved in silence for the lives lost, many of whom were never properly buried. Some survivors carried visible scars, others bore wounds no one could see, fear, rage, trauma, but through it all, they endured. Some families left Tulsa forever, unable to bear the memories. Others stayed, determined to honor those who had been lost by refusing to surrender their home. The very act of surviving became a form of resistance. And so Greenwood, scarred and silenced, began to breathe again, not with shouts, but with whispers of rebuilding. One nail, one brick, one prayer at a time. It was not just a neighborhood rising from the ashes, it was a people reclaiming their place in history. Chapter 13. Burying the Truth. As the months passed, the ashes of Greenwood slowly settled, but not only over the streets and buildings, they settled over the truth itself. What had happened in Tulsa was no longer being discussed publicly. Officials, newspapers, and white residents of the city began a concerted effort to bury not just the bodies, but the story. Official records were quietly amended. Photographs were hidden or destroyed. Survivors were discouraged from speaking out. In schools across Oklahoma, the massacre went unmentioned. History textbooks omitted the events entirely. A silence wrapped around Greenwood's memory like a shroud. City leaders moved quickly to reshape the narrative. The destruction of Greenwood was portrayed as an unfortunate riot sparked by unrest and violence on both sides. This false equivalence absolved the white mob of responsibility and erased the calculated nature of the attack. Even the insurance companies, citing riot clauses, denied claims filed by black property owners. justice was not only denied, it was erased. Journalists who attempted to investigate further were met with threats or dismissed. Ministers who spoke out were labeled agitators. Survivors who tried to rebuild were discouraged with red tape and resistance. Entire generations of Tulsans would grow up without ever learning the truth of what had happened in their own backyard. And yet the truth refused to die. In the quiet of family living rooms, elders whispered to their grandchildren. In the margins of old photographs, dates and names were scrawled. In the soil beneath Greenwood, pieces of buildings, toys, and bone told a story that could not be completely erased. For decades, the truth of the Tulsa Massacre lived in fragments, in memories, in the voices of those who dared to remember, and in the silence of those who had seen too much to speak. The truth was buried, but it was not gone, and one day it would rise again. Chapter 14. Echoes of Justice. Decades passed, survivors aged and died. Greenwood's ruins slowly gave way to new buildings, some of them never acknowledging what had stood there before. But the memory lingered, tucked in basements, held in church pews, etched into headstones, and whispered across kitchen tables. For many years, the city of Tulsa remained silent. Official acknowledgement was non-existent. National memory had moved on, but the survivors and their children and grandchildren had not. They carried their stories forward, each telling a part of the truth that had been buried under decades of denial. In the late 20th century, voices began to rise. Activists, historians, journalists, and descendants demanded recognition. They called for justice, not only in words, but in action, reparations, restoration, and a rewriting of history that included the voices that had been ignored. In 1996, the state of Oklahoma created the Tulsa Race Riot Commission, later renamed the Tulsa Race Massacre Commission. For the first time, the government officially used the word massacre to describe what happened. Testimonies were recorded. Mass graves were investigated. The truth, long smothered by ash and indifference, began to claw its way into daylight. Still, justice was slow. Some survivors, now over 100 years old, stood before lawmakers and television cameras, recounting what they saw with tears in their eyes. Their strength and memory lit a fire that spread across the country. In classrooms, teachers began telling the story of Greenwood. In documentaries and books, the story reached millions. But apologies, while powerful, did not rebuild homes. Acknowledgement, while necessary, could not restore what was taken. And so the fight continued, not just to remember, but to repair. Greenwood was not just a place that was destroyed. It was a promise still waiting to be fulfilled, and its echoes now ring louder than ever. Chapter 15. Remembering Greenwood. In the quiet hours of the present, Greenwood breathes again, not in the same way it once did, with bustling businesses and jazz flowing from windows, but as memory, movement, and message. The stories once whispered in the shadows are now spoken aloud in auditoriums, classrooms, churches, and city halls. The truth is no longer buried. Today, Greenwood is not just remembered, it is honored. Memorials now stand on the sacred ground where Black dreams once rose and were raised. The Greenwood Cultural Center and other institutions chronicle the history of Black Wall Street with photographs, interviews, and recovered artifacts. giving names to the forgotten and voice to the silenced. The memory of the massacre pulses through art, music, and activism. Murals color the walls of Tulsa with portraits of strength and defiance. Scholars research the truths that textbooks ignored. Activists continue to push for reparations and justice not just in Tulsa, but for all communities harmed by systemic racism. Descendants of Greenwood's families organize, advocate, and rebuild, not only to honor the past, but to forge a future built on truth. For many, remembering Greenwood is more than a historical exercise. It's an act of resistance, a refusal to allow another generation to forget the lives lost, the culture destroyed, and the silence that followed. It is a call to hold history accountable. Each June, during the anniversary of the massacre, people gather in remembrance. Candles are lit, names are read, prayers are spoken beneath the Oklahoma sky, and with every year, more join, more remember, more understand. Greenwood is not gone. It lives in every act of remembrance, in every story shared, in every step toward justice. Its spirit endures, not just in Tulsa, but wherever people dare to remember, to rebuild, and to rise. To remember Greenwood is not only to mourn. It is to promise, never again.